Hi everyone. This video is to go alongside the work that has been set this week, talking about human rights in China. You will need some of this information to complete the tasks, but remember you can pause it at any point, you can skip ahead, rewind, and come back to it when a time is good for you. You also have a copy of these slides that you should be seeing on the screen in the video just now. These are available to you if you want to take your time to read through them as well. I know lots of people like to work in different ways. The first section we're going to talk about today is human rights violations. Quite a big word, basically means people or someone is not getting their human rights. A human rights violation is when they're being stopped from getting it. Human rights in China are quite a big deal, and they have been for years and years. It's well known that there are a lot of issues in China with human rights. Lots of people claim not to get human rights or that they've never had them. Over the years, there's been lots of cases of people mysteriously going missing and not being seen again, not being in contact with families, journalists who no longer are reporting on things. We also know of cases where people have been beaten up because they have spoken and criticised the Chinese government. China, however, says that there are no human rights problems. The government say that they do things properly, that everyone is treated freely and fairly. What we're going to talk about are some of these violations. You need to know at least 3 of these. The first one is related to something called Falun Gong. Falun Gong is a religion. It's actually not too different from Buddhism. It's very spiritual and it's based on non-violence. Those that practice Falun Gong as a religion, as a belief, don't want to use violence. They don't believe in hatred. They believe in peace and truth. This religion was banned in 1999. So for the past 21 years, it has been illegal to practice this religion. This means that if you were in Scotland and you were a Christian who went to church on a Sunday, it's the equivalent of making that illegal. Imagine how that would affect some people. People have tried to keep supporting it. Some people have tried to continue with the faith, with the belief system, and they've ended up in prison, and they've in fact ended up in labour camps. A labour camp is somewhere that you're sent to do really difficult, horrible jobs with no pay, with not good conditions. In addition to this, you might have seen in the news last year that China is facing accusations that they have been running prison camps for those of the Muslim faith to try and convert them into the Chinese way of life. China denies that these places exist. However, there has been footage seen, so we know that religion is very tightly controlled in China. We also know, and have seen some of this already in the work we've done, that protesting is frowned upon in China. If you speak out against the government, if you criticise them and say, I disagree with you because I think you're wrong because, you can end up in prison. From July until October 2015, over 245 lawyers and activists had been targeted by the government. That means over 200 people with a legal background who know the law and who were criticising the government in a very short space of time faced punishments such as prison, being beaten up, being stopped from practising law, and kind of tightly controlled. We also know that lots of women have been stopped from talking about domestic violence. China doesn't want to say that there's a domestic violence problem, so that's when there's violence in the home. So lots of those people have been banned from speaking out or protesting for rights for victims. There's also a lot of corruption in the police in China. They will take bribes. If you're rich, you might get away with something because you can afford to pay the police. Or some members of the police are always quite brutal and they'll use their batons or sprays or, things that we wouldn't do here in the UK. Recent protests in Hong Kong that you might have seen over the last year have also seen lots of people injured and really badly hurt through the water cannons, the rubber bullets, the protesters, the police, the soldiers that are involved. So again, we know that freedom of speech is really, really tightly controlled and limited in China. Finally, I'm going to talk to you about the last two things we'll discuss in this lesson. The first one is the death penalty. China still believes in using the death penalty. If you look at organizations such as Amnesty International, who look to support and help people, they think the death penalty should be banned worldwide for everything, because you never know if you've made a mistake, you've got the wrong person, taking a life in any way is never good. But there are people who believe the death penalty should be used in some circumstances. I am not saying whether it is right or wrong. I know you have your own opinion on that, which is valid and is good. However, the problem people have with China is they execute more people in 1 year than the rest of the world combined in a year. So in 1 year in China, more people will be put to death than every single other country uses the death penalty. They also never release statistics. The USA, for example, has the death penalty, and they always report honestly on how many people have been put to death using their methods. They're open and transparent about it. We don't know about China. We think we know, but we can't be sure. And finally, trade unions. A trade union is when a group of people that share something similar, normally a job, come together to fight for better rights. For example, there are teachers' unions. I signed up to a teacher union. Not everybody agrees these are a good idea, but it means that if I needed help with something, if I needed legal help, if I needed advice about my job, or I got really, really, really unhappy about my job, I can talk to them and they will support me. In most countries, trade unions are seen as a good thing because it gives people who work someone to talk to about problems in their workplace. These are banned in China. If people go on strike, they're often intimidated or arrested by the police. This essentially means officials will say, either you stop going on strike or you and your family all lose your jobs. They're trying to pressure them into something. So they do not have freedom of assembly. That's what we talked about in S2 Modern Studies. If you're ready for the next lesson, pause here or come back and visit when you're ready to do the lesson on the one-child policy. I'm going to talk about the one-child policy here, which you do have a lesson on, and I'll talk you through what I'm expecting for the activity today as well. First, I want to ask you a question. I want you to pause and have a think. There is a quote here: overpopulation is a huge problem globally. We should stop people having big families. That is a quote from someone. I would like you to pause and think, do you agree or disagree with that? And think of two reasons why. So overpopulation, that means there are too many people on our planet. Too many people that we have to feed, that we have to house, that we have to provide education and healthcare for. So would you limit the size of families people can have? Now, if we were in class, I would open this up to a debate because it can get quite heated and quite competitive. There is no wrong answer. What I'm interested here is your opinion and how you think that through. China began to get concerned about the amount of people in the world years and years ago. In 1979, they decided to do something official. They introduced the one-child policy. The picture you see there is a form of propaganda. That's something that was released by the government to make this sound like it was an amazing idea to introduce. Families were told they could only have one child. So that's it. Your family will be mum, dad, and child. Your child will then marry, and then they will have one child. The idea behind this was it would limit how many people were in China. It would mean that resources could be prioritized, that people were not having 8, 9, 10, 11 children and struggling to feed them or rely on the government. They hoped this would slow the population down a little bit, because what was happening in China is you had lots of people who were suddenly having 2, 3, 4 children. That means they need bigger houses, so they have to move. But who goes into the smaller houses? So it causes lots of problems. It's worth remembering at this point that the population of China is the second highest in the whole world. Are they right to be concerned? Here are a couple of graphs for you to have a look at, and I'll talk you through them as well. The graph that is on the top half that says fewer children and young people, both the lines go down the way. What that is showing you is how many children and young people there have been in China every 5 years. The red line, so that's the one that starts slightly higher on the graph at 150, that is China's line. The blue line, which is just slightly lower at the beginning, is the world average. Okay, so what we see here, and you don't need to worry too much about the numbers on the side, okay? I've deliberately kind of left those off, I want you to just look at the graph. You can see where the one-child policy was introduced, where there were hundreds and thousands of people under the age of 24, and you can see that goes down a huge amount to the year 2015. If you compare that to the world average, the greeny blue line, you'll see that although the world average has gone down, it's not really steep, so it's not really sudden. The China one is quite sudden. That means that there's much less young people in China. What problems might that cause? The other graph you have is the population getting older. So that's the one that's on the bottom half of the screen. And this is looking at older people, so those 65 and older. How much of the population is that? Again, the red line is the Chinese line, and the blue is the world average. What we see here, if you look there, the red line goes up and up and up. So even from 1979, you're now controlling how many people, you're now controlling that you can only have one child, but there's lots more old people. What these graphs show us is, in the same time period, the amount of people under the age of 25 has dropped, but the amount of people over 65 has gone up. Is that a good thing? What I would advise you to think about here is thinking, okay, who looks after those age 65 and older? Because we know that people in that group are more likely to need help with their health, help with their housing, they might have to look after them. Okay, that's the young people, great. But there's less young people. So how do they help everyone? Because there's not enough of them. This has caused loads of problems. By the end of this lesson, you might end up agreeing with the one-child policy. That's fine. All I will ask is that you can tell me why. What we have found is China have what's called a leftover of men. Because people are only allowed to have one child, they see baby boys as more important than baby girls. Traditionally, people hand down everything to the son first. If you look at kings and queens, for example, throughout history, you tend to have kings because the daughter, even though she was firstborn, would be looked over because males were seen as more important. Unfortunately, this meant if women thought they were carrying a child, that they would try and get rid of it if they thought it was a female. Obviously, this is quite upsetting. This is what they've done. Things are getting better. We know that there are 114 men for every 100 women in the age bracket where marriage is most common. That means on average there, you have 14 men who have no choice of getting a wife. They have no chance of having a partner to then have family. We also unfortunately saw a rise in the amount of baby girls who were killed by family members or left abandoned because they thought if they got rid of that child, they could go on to have another one that would hopefully be a boy. Having a boy means they can pass down the family business, the family name, the money, anything they've inherited. It was seen as very powerful. Thankfully, in 2015, China realised that this wasn't working. They announced it would no longer stick to the one-child policy and would allow people to have two. What they have noticed is that people in rural areas, so with large areas of farmland, have had more than one child over the years. The reason being the help is needed on the farm. They physically need the bodies of those people to work on the farms. So the Chinese government turned a bit of a blind eye and said, well, if you're looking after your children and they're on the farm and you've got 3 of them, but they're all working and doing things, we'll ignore it, it's fine. It was in built-up cities that China was being really picky. So if someone was staying in the middle of Beijing and they had 3 children, they would be fined, and they would have to pay money because they had more than one child, or they would stop receiving any kind of benefit and support for those further 2 children. The first child, for example, would get the free education, anything like that. The other 2 wouldn't, because you broke the rules. Now, what you have here is lots of evidence to either support or go against the one-child policy. There are 6 for each. All of them are points that people can consider. If you feel confident to tackle this challenge, stop the video here and get going. If you'd like some help, I'm going to talk through what each of these boxes mean. I'm going to start with controls the population, and I'm going to go down each column to talk through them. Number 1, it controls the population. That's pretty straightforward. It means that the population is not getting bigger and bigger and bigger all the time. It puts a limit on how many people can live in the country at that time. Something called the 4-2-1 problem. This is when one person has to care for their parents and grandparents. Because we're saying that there are less young people, but there are more elderly people, what you find is that one child, remember you're only allowed one child, imagine that is you at the moment, okay? That one child, when their parents get old, has got to care for 2 of their parents. China is very traditional in that it believes you don't put your family into homes or care, you bring them into your own home and look after them. So you're looking after your parents. However, their parents were both very healthy. They still have both their mum and dad around, so you now have to look after them. So you've got your granny and granda on both sides and your mum and dad. And that creates the 4-2-1 problem. 4 being the grandparents who are still alive, 2 being the parents, and 1 being the child who now has this care responsibility. We also know the abortion rate has gone up. More people are opting, not that they want to really, but are opting to have an abortion because they think that their child may be female or they may have a severe disability. We've also got unequal enforcement. What this means is in certain areas, they were kind of going, I'm just going to pretend that I've not seen your second and third child. Rural areas were let off to help the farm. Okay, they're working, they're busy, we won't give you a fine. We know that lots of infant girls have been killed. As mentioned previously, we know that there's been a big push to have more males because they're seen as more important. Both parents can work easier, better off financially. Well, this means that if you have less children, it's more likely that the family can go to work. They can both have jobs, childcare will be cheaper, they won't have to worry about spending so much in the holidays and things like that. The country was very cramped, not much housing. Back in 1979, people were living in houses that were far too small for their families because there were so many people. Now, would introducing the one-child policy help that or make it worse? Children get lots of attention from their parents. The less children you have, the more time you can devote on them, the more presents you can buy them, the more love you can give them. There will be nobody to look after the elderly. Considering it's young people we need to look after those group, which group is it we're missing people in? You can get benefits for your child, such as free schooling or a reduced cost on schooling. You might get food packages. If you're really poor, you might get access to other things to help you look after your one child. If you have more than one child, however, you will lose benefits. You will either lose them completely because you broke all the rules, or you will only get the benefits for child number 1, and then the rest have to fend for themselves. We also know that back in the 1970s, there was a lack of food. There were so many people on the go that lots were dying of starvation, which is a really long process, and were unhappy. Want you to have a go at that. Your colour coding, you can do it by hand, you can print it out, you can just change the font color, whatever is easiest for you guys. That's your lessons for this week. I'll be in touch with you soon, and I hope you all have a good week.